The knock at the door came at twilight, that uneasy hour when shadows stretch long and the world teeters on the edge of night. I opened it to find two young men standing on my porch, their smiles sharp and unsettling. "Good evening, sir," the first one said, his voice too cheerful, too eager. "We've come to share the message of our Lord and Savior, Satan." I froze, my mind scrambling to process what I'd just heard. Their crisp white shirts and black slacks gave them the air of door-to-door missionaries, but their eyes glinted with something unnatural, something wrong. Yeah, no thanks," I muttered, starting to close the door. But the first man's foot jammed into the gap, stopping it cold. "Please, sir," he said, his smile never faltering, "just a moment of your time." Behind him, his companion opened a battered suitcase. My breath caught when I saw what was inside. Neat stacks of $100 bills. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. "Is that real?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Of course, sir," the first man said, his grin widening. "Go ahead, take a look." My hands trembled as I picked up a bundle. The weight, the texture, it all seemed real. Too real. I looked back at the two men, their faces still frozen in those unnerving smiles. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I stepped aside and let them in. We sat around the coffee table, the suitcase of money between us. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until I cleared my throat. "So," I began, "you said you had a message?" The first man leaned forward, his smile somehow growing wider. "Indeed, sir. Satan is recruiting for skilled labor positions in hell, and we've identified you as a top candidate. Congratulations." My gaze darted to the suitcase, then back to them. "What kind of job are we talking about here?" "Excellent question," the man said, his enthusiasm almost grotesque. "The details are all outlined in this contract." The second man produced a single sheet of paper from somewhere unseen and laid it on the table. The writing on it was jagged, alien, and seemed to writhe if I looked too long. I can't read this," I said. "Ah, of course," the first man replied. "It's written in Old Enochian, the language of angels. Unfortunately, we're not authorized to translate. But rest assured, the terms are most favorable." "And the money?" I asked, gesturing to the suitcase. "Yours upon signing," he said. "A signing bonus, if you will." I hesitated, the room seeming to grow darker, the air heavier. But the money was real, wasn't it? I grabbed a pen and scrawled my name at the bottom of the page. The second man snatched the contract, his movements unnaturally fast. "Wonderful," the first man exclaimed. "Now, let's be off." "Off?" I repeated, confusion giving way to dread. "What do you mean?" The floor beneath me cracked with a deafening roar, and suddenly we were falling. The air screamed past us as a searing red glow grew brighter below. I clawed at the empty space, but the two men simply grinned, their ties flapping wildly in the wind. "Welcome aboard," the first man shouted over the roar, his voice dripping with glee. And then the heat swallowed us whole. We hit the ground hard, the glowing red dirt scorching and rough beneath us. The impact sent a cloud of dust swirling around, choking the air and stinging my eyes. When it settled, I found myself in a bizarre space, part cavern, part office. Jagged stalactites hung from the ceiling, and flickering torches cast unsettling shadows on the walls. At the center of the room stood a massive obsidian desk, polished to a sinister shine. Behind the desk, a high-backed leather chair slowly swiveled around, revealing a demon. His crimson skin gleamed like fresh blood, and his sharp teeth curved into a grin far too wide for comfort. He wore a tailored black suit that only made his glowing yellow eyes more menacing. "Ah, David," the demon said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "Welcome. I'm Satan. Let's talk about that job." I stumbled to my feet, my heart pounding. What in God's name is going on here? I stammered. Satan arched a thin black eyebrow. "In whose name?" he asked, his grin widening. I just meant, I began, but he cut me off with a booming laugh that echoed through the cavern like rolling thunder. I'm joking, David. Relax, he said, though his tone did little to put me at ease. But seriously, you're going to have to work on that sense of humor if you want to make it here in hell. My name's not Jerry, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Satan frowned, pulling a manila folder from his desk. He slipped on a pair of reading glasses and flipped through the pages, his long clawed fingers tapping impatiently. Wait a minute, he said, squinting at the file. You're not Jerry Smith, satanic cult leader and master of unholy magic? No, I replied, my voice cracking. I'm just an accountant. Satan scratched his goatee, his expression souring. Well, that's a problem. Do you at least have a bachelor's degree in unholy magic? What? No, is that even a thing? I asked, incredulous. Of course it is, Satan said, throwing up his hands. We even have an online program through the University of Phoenix. I blinked. Isn't that place a scam? Satan leaned back in his chair, laughing again. A scam? Because they lure naive souls with promises of a brighter future, and then leave them saddled with debt and a worthless degree? David, down here, we call that business acumen. Plus, thanks to some creative legal maneuvering, we get the implicit right to employ 20% of their graduates after death. Genius, really. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my mouth dry. Well, Satan said, closing the folder with a sigh. You're clearly not what we were expecting, but you signed the contract. And let me tell you, the penalties for breach are unpleasant. So you're stuck here for now. He turned his attention to the corner of the room where Paul and Stephen stood, their grins still plastered unnaturally wide across their faces. And as for you two, Satan said, his voice sharp, get out of those human suits. You're creeping me out. Yes, sir, Paul said. There was a sickening, wet tearing sound as their faces split down the middle. Two enormous, insect-like heads emerged from their necks, mandibles clicking as the rest of their human skin slid off in a grotesque heap on the floor. Their true forms were hideous, towering, multi-limbed demons with glistening exoskeletons. Satan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Why don't you ever wear clothes under those suits? This is an office, for hell's sake. Sorry, Mr. Satan, sir, Paul mumbled, his voice now a guttural rasp. It's just hot. We're in hell, Satan snapped. You should be used to it by now. Yes, Mr. Satan, sir, Paul said, his mandibles switching nervously. Satan pressed a button on his desk phone. Tina, he said, his voice heavy with exasperation. Yes, Mr. Satan? Came a tired voice from the speaker. Send Grendel in to escort these two to HR and tell them to dock their pay for improper attire. Yes, Mr. Satan, Tina replied. The door creaked open and a massive blue-skinned demon lumbered in, a hatchet embedded deep in the back of his skull. Without a word, he grabbed Paul and Stephen, slinging them over his shoulders like sacks of meat. Their protests echoed down the hall as he carried them out. Satan shook his head. I should have fired those two eons ago, he muttered. But they're my wife's nephews. What can you do? I stood there, frozen, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or scream. Anyway, Satan said, turning back to me with a grin. Let's get started on your onboarding. Welcome to hell, David. Satan skimmed through the manila folder on his obsidian desk, his sharp black nails tapping the surface in an irregular rhythm. The sound echoed eerily in the cavernous office. His eyes flicked toward the corner, where two empty suits of human skin were draped like discarded clothing. I couldn't help but wonder if they had once been filled with actual humans before being hollowed out and repurposed. My thoughts were interrupted by Satan clearing his throat, a guttural bone-rattling sound that felt more like the growl of some ancient beast. Right, he said, his tone brisk. No sense in wasting time. Let's get down to brass tacks. I assume you're familiar with Orisnek's law of eternal soul entropy and hyperinflation. Orisnek's what? I stammered. Satan sighed, his crimson eyes narrowing as he scribbled something in the folder. "Of course you're not. Well, at the very least, you must know about Bao's index of human evil and the proper method for measuring a soul's value in infernal ledgers." No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Sutton's frown deepened as he jotted down another note. Then, with a sudden shudder, he tossed the folder into the roaring fireplace behind him. The flames flared bright purple for a moment, consuming the file in an instant. "That's fine," he said, his smile returning with unsettling ease. "It's all relatively straightforward. I'm sure you'll pick it up in no time." I nodded weakly, unsure if I even wanted to know what it was. "In the meantime," Sutton continued, pressing a button on his desk phone, "I'll assign you a training officer to help you learn the ropes and monitor your progress." "Yes, Mr. Satan," came a tired, gravelly voice through the speaker. "Tina, send in Frankentity," Sutton said, his tone casual. "Yes, Mr. Satan," Tina replied. A moment later, the massive double doors to the office burst open with a thunderous boom. An enormous figure lumbered in, and I instinctively recoiled. It was a grotesque parody of a teddy bear, its fur matted and stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. One of its button eyes had been replaced with a glowing red orb that burned like molten lava, and its mouth was lined with jagged, uneven teeth. "Yes, Lord Satan," it boomed, its voice so deep and resonant that it rattled my teeth in their sockets. "Frankentity, this is Jerry Smith," Satan said, gesturing toward me. "Master of Satanic Accounting." "Wait," I began, but Satan ignored me. "I need you to show him the ropes for the new project running out of Darrow's department. Think you can handle that?" Frankentity's glowing eye fixed on me, and I felt my knees weaken under the weight of his gaze. "I shall complete my task or die in the course of its glorious undertaking," he intoned solemnly. Then he turned fully toward me. "Come, yeoman," he commanded. "We have work to do." I tried to stand, but my legs refused to cooperate. My stomach churned, and the heat of his stare felt like it was burning a hole straight through me. Satan," I managed to croak. "You don't have any human training officers?" Satan's eyes narrowed. "Why? Are you some kind of racist, Jerry?" "No. I just meant." "And Frankentity isn't a real teddy bear," Satan added, shaking his head. "Honestly, Jerry, that's pretty insensitive. Besides, you've got nothing to worry about. Frankentity is one of our finest officers. He's only authorized to use lethal force in extreme circumstances. That's comforting," I said weakly. "Come, tiny human," Frankentity roared, motioning for me to follow him. I stumbled to my feet and trailed after him into a dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with doors, each one sealed tightly, but the muffled screams from behind them were unmistakable. I felt the dread bubbling in my stomach begin to rise to my throat. "It is time for your first and most important lesson," Frankentity said, his voice booming like a thunderclap. "In the everlasting kingdom of hell, all circumstances qualify as extreme." My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I opened my mouth to respond, but all that escaped was a strangled gasp. The hallway stretched on endlessly, each step accompanied by the sounds of anguish and despair. At last, Frankentity stopped in front of a door marked Darrow's department and shoved it open. The room was a cramped, dimly lit office illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. A foul stench hung in the air, and the walls were covered in peeling charred wallpaper. "The new satanic thrall has arrived," Frankentity bellowed. From behind a desk piled high with ominous-looking files, a short reptilian demon waddled forward. His scales were a sickly green, and his potbelly strained against the buttons of his shirt. He eyed me with a mixture of disdain and amusement. "This is the best they could send me?" Darrow hissed, his forked tongue flicking out as he spoke. Frankentity loomed behind me, his glowing eye boring into my back. "He shall learn," the monstrous bear rumbled. I wasn't so sure. Darrow peered at me over his wire-rimmed spectacles, his leathery face creasing with an expression of mild irritation. "Jerry Smith, master of satanic magic," he said flatly, his tone dripping with disbelief. "There's been a mix-up." "Frankentitty, this is David Robbins, master of satanic accounting." "Just accounting," I corrected weakly. Darrow crossed his arms, the leathery skin of his elbows cracking audibly. "What am I supposed to do with a regular Earth accountant?" he demanded. "This is no good. Tell them to send him back." "We can't send him back," Frankentitty rumbled, his deep voice resonating through the room like distant thunder. "He's already signed the contract." Darrow sighed heavily and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Of course he has," he muttered. He turned and motioned for me to follow. "Come on, I'll show you to your desk." I trailed behind him, my footsteps echoing hollowly in the dim hallway. He stopped at a small, battered metal desk bolted to the floor. A rusted manacle dangled ominously from one of the legs. "Don't worry," Darrow said, noticing my wide-eyed stare. "We don't use the chains anymore. New labor regulations and all that." "That's great," I said faintly. "So," Darrow continued, "I assume you know what you're supposed to be doing here?" The contract would have been very detailed. "Well," I stammered, "it was written in Notion." Darrow froze, then slowly turned to look at me over the top of his glasses. "You mean to tell me you can't read infernal Notion?" "Yeah." "That's right," I admitted. Darrow groaned and pulled off his spectacles, rubbing his sunken eyes. "And yet Satan still refuses to let department heads interview new candidates," he muttered despondently. "All right, listen up. This isn't an exciting department. We're middlemen. We deal with the buying and selling of souls. Why would you buy a human soul?" I asked, my voice tinged with unease. "For various cosmic entities," Darrow replied with a shrug. "And what do they do with them?" "We don't deal with that in this department," Darrow said curtly. "We're strictly transactional." "I always thought hell was the final destination for damned souls," I said. Darrow snorted. "First off, even if hell were the final destination, it would still need middlemen. And second, hell is a multi-dimensional corporation. We don't just trade souls, we're involved in all kinds of businesses. Just last week, we closed a big endorsement deal with an A-list movie star for one of our reverse mortgage companies." "You got a movie star to sign a deal with Satan?" I asked, incredulous. Darrow waved a hand dismissively. "Easy, we already own 90% of the souls in Hollywood." "Oh," I said, feeling my stomach churn. "Don't worry," Darrow said, clapping me on the shoulder. "It takes a little moral flexibility at first, but you'll get used to it. And all things considered, it's not a bad place to work. We've got an excellent medical plan, for instance." "Really?" I asked, surprised. "Oh, sure," Darrow said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "If any part of your body is bothering you, just let the medical department know, and they'll remove it. Almost totally free of charge. If you want anesthesia, though, you'll have to pay for that yourself." Before I could respond, a blood-curdling scream echoed down the hallway. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Oh," Darrow said casually, "that's Jeremy from HR. He had a hangnail, and the medical department decided to amputate his foot. Better safe than sorry, you know. If Jeremy doesn't have a foot, he can't rack up any more expensive medical issues." I glanced down at my own feet, my stomach twisting into knots. I think I'd like to opt out of the medical plan," I said. "I need all my body parts to live." Darrow raised an eyebrow. "If that's the case, I'd stay far away from the office paper shredder. It's terribly aggressive." I followed his gaze to the corner of the room, where a hulking metal shredder loomed. The top was slick with fresh blood, and the floor around it was spattered with crimson stains. "What do you mean by aggressive?" I asked hesitantly. Just then, a small amphibian-like demon shuffled past, its nose buried in a folder. Without warning, a spring-loaded panel in the floor catapulted the demon directly into the shredder's gaping maw. The machine roared to life with a sickening grinding noise, and blood sprayed across the ceiling in a gruesome arc. Damn it! Darrow snapped, wiping a splatter of blood off his glasses. That's the third one this week. I stared at the machine in horror, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. Welcome to hell, Darrow said dryly. You'll fit right in. I keep telling the interns not to go near the shredder, but they never listen, Darrow muttered, shaking his head as he wiped fresh blood off his glasses. We'll have to order another badge from the local community college recruitment pool. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. A wave of nausea churned in my stomach, threatening to rise. You okay? Darrow asked, tilting his head slightly as he studied me. You look a little green. I'm fine, I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. You sure? He pressed. Maybe you need a quick visit to the medical department. No, I shouted, louder than I intended. I mean, I'm fine, really, just not sure I'm comfortable with the whole selling human souls thing. Darrow sighed, his leathery face wrinkling further as he leaned back in his chair. It's just business, David. You know what that means, right? Yeah, I guess, I mumbled. Frankentity, who had been looming silently in the corner, finally spoke, his voice a deep, guttural boom that made the walls tremble. It's just business, he said. Is what you say when you want to do something terrible and not feel bad about it afterward. No, Darrow snapped, rubbing his temples. That's not it at all. Frankentity shrugged, his massive shoulders creaking like old wood. That's what Satan told me, he said matter-of-factly. You're all going to give me an aneurysm, Darrow muttered. Look, at the very least, I assume you know about the new project? It's the whole reason Satan hired you. Oh yeah, I said, perking up slightly. He mentioned something about that. Good, Darrow said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. This is top secret, he glanced at Frankentity. Which means you need to leave. Frankentity crossed his arms, his glowing red eye narrowing. I have the highest security clearance in hell, he protested. Yes, and you also have a big mouth and a head full of stuffing, Darrow shot back. Now get out. Fine, Frankentity grumbled, stomping toward the door. I didn't want to know anyway. The door slammed shut behind him with enough force to rattle the walls. Darrow waited a beat, then hurled a stapler at the door. Ow, came Frankentity's muffled voice, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. Now we can talk, Darrow said, turning back to me. So you're an accountant. I assume you understand supply and demand? Vaguely, I admitted. Good enough, he said. Here's the deal. As middlemen in the exchange of souls between dimensions, our profit margins depend entirely on controlling the flow of souls. Hell used to have a monopoly, but recently, we've been losing ground. Losing ground? I asked, dreading the answer. New competitors, Darrow said grimly. Pop-up religions, niche cults. Combine that with the global population boom, and souls are being devalued. Meanwhile, we're losing control of key markets. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Hollywood, for example, has been our crown jewel. We've invested heavily there, securing celebrity endorsements for pennies on the dollar. It's allowed us to funnel souls from across the country. But now, he trailed off, his voice lowering to a whisper. Now? I prompted. Now, he said, glancing around nervously. A certain fad religion is stealing celebrity souls right out from under us. Wait, I said, realization dawning. Are you talking about Scientology? SHH, Darrow hissed, his eyes darting to the door. Never say the S word around here. Are you trying to get us sued? Sorry, I said quickly. In this department, Darrow continued, we use a code word. From now on, refer to them as BS. I asked. Short for beating Scientology, Darrow said, obviously. Right, I said, nodding. Our plan, Darrow said, leaning back in his chair, is to crush them economically first. After all, we can't just go around beating rich people to death in the streets. Not yet anyway. No, I said. I guess not. Exactly, Darrow said, clapping his hands together. So now that we're on the same page, let's get started. I swallowed hard, wondering if I'd survive long enough to regret signing that contract. Darrow's crooked finger beckoned me toward a door at the far end of the office. It was old, warped wood, stained darker near the edges as though it had absorbed centuries of unspeakable things. Beside it hung a cracked brown plastic plaque that read in faded, blocky letters, "Disintegration Room." The words alone sent a chill racing down my spine. Darrow pushed the door open with a creak that echoed unnaturally loud, the sound lingering in the air like a scream cut short. Beyond the threshold was nothing but darkness, thick, oppressive, and endless. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt alive, as though it was watching us. "Come on," Darrow said, turning back to me, his eyebrows raised impatiently. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey. My entire body felt frozen, paralyzed by an instinctive, primal terror. "Aren't you coming?" Darrow asked, his tone casual, almost bored, as if he didn't notice or care that I was on the verge of vomiting. "Darrow," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. What's the disintegration room?" He tilted his head, a thin smile creeping across his face. It didn't reach his eyes, which gleamed with something cold and predatory. "Ah," he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "That, my dear David, is the foundation of our entire plan." Something moved in the shadows beyond the door, a faint rustle, like dry leaves scraping across stone, or perhaps bones. My stomach churned violently, and I swallowed hard to keep the bile from rising. Whatever lay beyond that door, I was certain of one thing: stepping through it would change me forever. If I survived at all,